You're me.
What's up?
I don't have a gap in my teeth.
Yeah, wear your retainer. Left boob, 1 cup smaller than the right.
Holy shit. I'm actually kind of hot for being middle-aged.
I'm 39 years old. That's not middle-aged.
No, that is middle-aged.
No, it's not.
You know, when you requested this deep dive on Mia Goth and her horror pics, I knew right away we were in for a real treat. Like, going beyond just, oh, she's the new Scream Queen, you know?
Yeah.
Because honestly, that just feels, I don't know, kind of surface level, don't you think?
Absolutely. There's a real thoughtfulness to her filmography, wouldn't you say? It goes way beyond just chasing screams.
Exactly. And that's what we're digging into today, especially with this film, A Cure for Wellness. It might not be on everyone's radar, but it really showcases, I think, Goth's eye for projects that, you know, they connect with horror on a much deeper level.
You know what's fascinating about A Cure for Wellness, even if you haven't seen it, the way it weaves in elements of those classic Universal monster movies, you know, the classics we all know.
Okay, so we're talking like Dracula, Frankenstein, that whole crew. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, let's take Dr. Heinrich Vollmer, the film's antagonist. On the surface, he might seem like just another creepy doctor, right?
Sure.
But his actions, the kidnappings, those experiments, the obsession with longevity, they directly parallel Dr. Frankenstein. Both characters, driven by this desire to control life and death, to cheat the natural order.
It's giving like mad scientist vibes for sure, but with like a more sinister modern twist.
Right, and visually, Verbinski, the director, takes it a step further.
Right.
You know how striking, how unsettling Vollmer's appearance is in the film. He's not just some, you know, guy in a lab coat.
Oh yeah, no, his face is like seared into my memory, so eerie.
But that's no accident. Visually, Vollmer is this haunting combination of Frankenstein's monster and Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera. It's like Verbinski took those classic monster makeup techniques and then kind of made them his own, creating this unsettling, almost tragic figure.
It's like he's pulling from those visual cues that terrified audiences like decades ago and finding a way to make them relevant and scary for a modern audience. But you said it goes even deeper than the visuals, right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember how obsessed Vollmer is with this idea of a pure bloodline? He wants to have a child with his sister to continue his, well, you know, twisted legacy.
Okay, that's like next level creepy right there.
Exactly. And that obsession with lineage, with using unorthodox means to achieve it, that directly echoes classic monsters like Dracula, even the Mummy. They're driven by this desire for power, yes, but also this need to preserve their bloodline, even if it means, you know, resorting to unnatural methods. It taps into this primal fear of corrupted legacy, of something being deeply wrong with the natural order of things.
And this is what I think is so cool about what Verbinski's doing in A Cure for Wellness. He's not just copying those classic monsters, he's understanding why they still resonate with audiences, what those deep-seated fears are. And he's finding these really cool ways to weave them into this new narrative. It's like he did a whole masterclass on horror history and then said, okay, watch this.
And it's that depth of understanding that sets this film apart, even if it wasn't a massive, you know, box office hit. Because it's one thing to have just a creepy doctor experimenting on people, but it's another thing entirely to ground that creepiness in this rich tapestry of classic horror themes.
It's like he's saying, hey, remember those things that scared you as a kid? Yeah, they're still scary. But instead of it being cheesy or predictable, it feels fresh and unsettling because he just like understands the assignment on such a fundamental level. So how do you think audiences missed that?
Well, I think sometimes when a film subverts expectations and it doesn't fit neatly into a box, audiences aren't quite sure what to make of it. That's also where I think revisiting A Cure for Wellness gets really rewarding. Especially if we think about the director for a moment, Gore Verbinski. This isn't just some director, you know, dabbling in horror. This is the guy who gave us The Ring, which, let me tell you, is a masterclass in atmosphere and slowly building dread.
Oh, absolutely.
And on top of that, he directed the first 3 Pirates of the Caribbean films. So we know he can craft a visually stunning and engaging story. Even if it is, and let's be real, A Cure for Wellness is definitely unsettling.
And speaking of unsettling, the visuals in this film are something else. Someone once described it as having like a Shining vibe, and I instantly knew what they meant. It's not about those jump scares, you know, the ones that make you spill your popcorn. It's that slow creeping unease that gets under your skin and just stays with you.
And that's a deliberate choice by Verbinski. He's using visuals to tell the story, to build that atmosphere of dread, like you're trapped in that wellness center, right alongside Lockhart, the main character. He wants you to feel every bit of that mounting paranoia.
And that actually ties into what you were saying earlier about how A Cure for Wellness didn't fit neatly into a box.
Right.
It reminds me of how Mia Goth seems drawn to these projects that play with genre expectations. It's like she's not afraid to take risks, to be a part of something that challenges the audience.
Exactly. It's not just about being in a horror film. It's about being in a horror film that has something to say.
Which brings us to the X trilogy. Talk about not shying away from pushing boundaries. After A Cure for Wellness, it seems like Goth really embraced those darker, more complex roles.
And what's interesting is that both A Cure for Wellness and the X trilogy, particularly Max Xene, which we'll delve into more later, explore similar themes: ambition, desire, the passage of time, and how those things can twist and turn into something monstrous. They're all there, just approached from different angles.
It's like those themes are threads connecting her horror picks, even when the stories themselves are so vastly different. But before we get ahead of ourselves and dive into the neon-drenched world of Max Xene, let's pause here for a moment. You've heard us break down the connections between A Cure for Wellness and classic monster movies, but what do you think? How does knowing this change how you see the film?
Does it make it scarier, knowing where those influences come from? Or does it add a layer of meaning, knowing the depth of what Verbinski was going for?
It's interesting you mentioned those thematic threads, those connections between Goth's roles, because it actually leads us perfectly to Max Xene, that final film in Ti West's X trilogy, which, for anyone who hasn't had the pleasure, picks up with Goth's character Maxine. Years after the events of, X, we find her navigating the wild world of 1980s Hollywood. And when I say wild, I mean buckle up buttercup wild.
And you're right to call out the setting, because you see, while Max Xene might initially seem like a stylistic departure, from that gothic, oppressive atmosphere of A Cure for Wellness, both films actually share, I'd argue, a similar DNA when it comes to those classic horror influences we've been discussing.
Oh, really? Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, on the surface, you've got Max Xene tapping into that whole slasher craze, the one that, let's be real, dominated the 80s. But dig a little deeper, and you'll find these layers of homage to 70s and 80s exploitation cinema. Those gritty, over-the-top films, the ones that, pushed boundaries and often served as allegories for, social anxieties of the time.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. A Cure for Wellness taps into our fear of aging and the pursuit of unnatural solutions, right? Which, yeah, it mirrors those classic monster movie themes. So is Max Xene reflecting the anxieties of its time period through this lens of exploitation cinema?
Exactly. Think about it. You've got Maxine, this ambitious young woman, trying to make it in a system that's notorious for, let's just say, chewing people up and spitting them out, especially women. The film doesn't shy away from exploring that darker side of Hollywood, the exploitation, the objectification, the fear of being discarded when you're no longer considered, young or beautiful enough.
Which, now that you mention it, directly connects back to that theme of aging and the lengths people go to in A Cure for Wellness. But this time, it's not, some creepy doctor in a castle. It's the whole system of Hollywood that's the monster.
Precisely. And Maxine, with all her ambition, all that drive, she becomes both a product of that system and a force pushing back against it. It's like she's trying to outrun the very thing that threatens to consume her. And that's where I think those classic monster movie parallels come into play again.
How so?
Well, think about those classic monsters for a second. They're often driven by desire, right? By a hunger for something they can't have, whether it's, eternal life, power, acceptance, whatever. And Maxine, in her own way, embodies that same kind of hunger. She craves success, recognition, and she's willing to go to extremes to achieve it. You could even argue that, in a way, she becomes monstrous herself in the process.
I never thought about it that way. But you're right, there is this darkness to her ambition, this ruthlessness that kind of emerges as she gets closer to her goal.
And that's what makes Goth's performance so compelling. She's not afraid to explore those morally gray areas, to make you question who you're rooting for. Maxine isn't some straightforward heroine. And that's what makes her so fascinating to watch.
It's like she's carrying the torch from those classic monsters, those Byronic figures, right? Who are both alluring and terrifying in their pursuit of what they desire. They might not be wielding pitchforks or hiding in castles, but those echoes are definitely there.
And much like Verbinski's masterful use of visuals in A Cure for Wellness, Ti West doesn't just tell us about the darkness lurking beneath Hollywood's, glamorous surface. He shows it to us through the film's visual language. For example, think about the vibrant, almost garish colors that permeate Max Cassian. It's like a neon-drenched fever dream.
Oh, yeah, the cinematography is stunning, but it's definitely intense. It's like that saying, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. Everything is so bright and shiny, but there's this underlying sense of unease, like it's all about to come crashing down.
And that's no accident. Those exaggerated colors, that almost hyper-real aesthetic, it reflects the excess and artificiality of, 1980s Hollywood, but it also serves as this constant reminder that beneath the glamour and the glitz, there's this dark underbelly of violence that's always simmering just below the surface.
It's like those candy-colored blood splatters you see in some scenes. You're simultaneously horrified and strangely mesmerized by the way it's presented.
Exactly. It's like Wes is saying, look, this is how easily we can become desensitized to violence, to exploitation when it's packaged in a visually appealing way. And then you have the camera work, those long lingering shots, those slow zooms that seem to trap the characters in their surroundings.
It's almost claustrophobic at times, even when the action spills out onto the sunny streets of LA. You get the sense that no matter where Maxine goes, she can't escape the madness.
Which, again, ties back to that feeling of being trapped.
Right.
Trapped by your circumstances, your desires, the expectations of the world around you. It's like West is holding up a mirror, not just to Hollywood, but to our own fascination with ambition, with spectacle, with the, often blurry lines between what's acceptable and what's monstrous.
It's interesting you should say that, because one thing that always strikes me about both A Cure for Wellness and the X trilogy, especially Max X16, is that while they're undoubtedly horror films, right, there's also this element of social commentary woven throughout. They're not just trying to scare you. They're making you think about the world around you in a different way.
And that's what makes Mia Goth such a compelling figure in, modern horror. She's drawn to those projects that dare to be more than just surface-level entertainment. She's not afraid to tackle complex themes, to push boundaries, and to make audiences really confront their own reactions to the characters and the stories being told.
It's like she's using horror as a lens to explore these larger questions about, humanity, about desire, about the choices we make and the consequences that follow.
And what's fascinating is that she's doing all of this while still delivering, let's be real, incredibly captivating and often terrifying performances. She's not sacrificing scares for substance. She's finding ways to make those two elements work in tandem.
So we've journeyed from the shadowy depths of A Cure for Wellness to the neon-soaked streets of Max X-Scene. And throughout it all, we've seen Mia Goth evolve as this scream queen who's not afraid to get her hands dirty, both literally and figuratively. But what does it all mean? What's the takeaway for our listeners who have joined us on this deep dive into Mia Goth's horror picks?
I think the most important thing to remember is that horror, at its best, is more than just, cheap thrills. It can be a reflection of our deepest fears, our cultural anxieties, and our own, complicated desires. And Mia Goth, through her bold choices, those fearless performances, she's proving to be a master at navigating those murky waters. She's not just reacting to the scares. She's driving the narrative, asking those uncomfortable questions, and pushing the genre in exciting new directions.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's not just about watching Mia Goth run from spooky villains, right? She's choosing these projects that really make you think about what's truly monstrous in these stories. Is it the masked killer, or is it something, more insidious lurking beneath the surface?
Precisely. And that brings us back to something we touched on earlier, those connections to classic monster movies. Because while Max X-Scene might not have, literal vampires or creatures hiding in the shadows, it taps into that same vein of exploring societal anxieties and those darker aspects of human nature, the themes that those classic films embodied so well.
So it's less about the monster under the bed and more about the monsters we create or the monsters we become when we chase our ambitions without really considering the costs.
Exactly. And I think that's why Mia Goth's work, even when it's gory and unsettling, right?
Right.
It resonates with audiences on such a visceral level because she's not just playing a role, she's embodying those fears and desires, ones that we all grapple with on some level.
It's like she's holding up a mirror to our collective psyche, but instead of showing us our reflections, it's showing us the monsters hiding just behind them.
And that's what makes her such a fascinating figure in contemporary horror. She's not afraid to get dark, to get messy, to make us uncomfortable. And in doing so, she's pushing the boundaries of the genre, asking us to confront not just what scares us on screen, but what scares us about ourselves and the world we live in.
It's funny because when you think about it, horror has always been this genre that reflects our deepest fears, our anxieties, right?
Right.
Whether it's the fear of the unknown, the fear of death, or, as we've been discussing, the fear of the monsters we might become.
Absolutely. And I think what Mia Goth is doing so brilliantly is taking those primal fears and she's filtering them through a modern lens. She's exploring those anxieties that feel particularly relevant today. The pressures of ambition, the fear of aging, the dark side of fame. And she's doing it with this raw, unflinching honesty. That's both captivating and unsettling.
So for our listeners who are now ready to, dive headfirst into Mia Goth's filmography, what's the key takeaway here? What makes her brand of horror worth seeking out?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Mia Goth's horror isn't just about the scares, although there are, let me tell you, plenty of those to be had. It's about the way she uses the genre to explore, deeper themes, to challenge our perceptions, to leave us with something to really think about long after the credits roll.
So the next time you're looking for a horror film that will stay with you, that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the genre, and maybe even yourself, do yourself a favor. Check out Mia Goth's work. You might be surprised at what you discover.
You might even find yourself sleeping with the lights on.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, happy watching and sweet dreams.